Hi guys, Samantha from Jessama Tutorials here, and today I'm going to be sharing some stamping on polymer clay tips with you. So we're going to start out with a really cool thing that you can get in some polymer clay textures, such as Helen Braille's textures. You can actually take these and you can run them through the pasta machine with your clay to create your texture, rather than having to just press it in. So I want to demonstrate this quickly. This is designed to go through the thickest setting on your pasta machine, and what I like to do is I like to take my clay and I will typically run this out to maybe about 0.8 millimeters thick, because if it's too thick it's going to distort quite a bit when you roll it through a pasta machine, I found. So I typically roll it out to about 0.8 millimeters thick. And then all you do is you take that and you're going to run that through your pasta machine from one end to the other. So I'm going to do that quickly. And here is your texture. And you can see it's really quick, really easy. The only thing that you do need to look out for is if you want the texture to come out exactly the same as the texture stamp, roll it through the pasta machine might not be the right way to go, because I do find that it does stretch the pattern just a little bit. Not too much to make a huge difference, but it does stretch the pattern a little bit. So generally, if a texture stamp can go through a pasta machine, the seller will let you know about that. The person who makes it will let you know. I know that pretty much all of Helen Braille's texture stamps go through the pasta machine, so that's a really cool aspect to those texture stamps. And there are a few others on the market that will do that as well. Okay, so that was just tip number 1, and I'm not sure if all of you know about that. So tip number 2 is how to work with hard polymer clay stamps. So I make my own polymer clay texture stamps, and they are made out of polymer clay, but this means that although they're strong, they're not particularly flexible. So you need to take a slightly different road when it comes to pressing your polymer clay into the stamp, because if you press just straight polymer clay into your texture stamp, it will stick directly to your texture. So if you're working with a polymer clay texture stamp, I recommend dusting your clay or your texture stamp with cornstarch. I typically dust my clay with cornstarch, and I'll say why in a second. Yeah, I just took some cornstarch and I'll just brush that over. Okay, and then I'm going to dust on the other side as well. Okay, then just get rid of all that excess, because you don't need that hanging around. Okay, and then you have your piece of clay, and it's not sticky on either side. Now you might be wondering why I did not just put cornstarch on the side that we're going to be pressing into the stamp. The reason for this is when you put it into your clay stamp, it's not going to want to stick in your clay stamp now, which is a good thing, but it means that if you're going to take your roller or even your fingers and you're going to be rolling across this, your clay is going to want to stick to your rollers or your fingers, which means you're going to lift it straight out of the stamp, and it's going to not create a nice clear image. So typically I prefer to put cornstarch on the back as well. Then take this and roll one way, and you can see that you have a groove over here. I like to flip it around, press my roller right against that groove, and roll in the opposite direction. Then generally I find that the roller doesn't tend to get the sides as much as I would like, so I just go around with my fingers and I just press on those sides to make sure that I've got a good impression. Okay, and I don't typically roll any more than that, because you can have the clay lift up and lay back down again, which creates a not very clear image. Now you can leave the cornstarch on the back if you want, but it means that it's not going to want to stick to any other pieces of clay. So what you can do is you can either use some water and scrub it to get rid of the cornstarch, or what I like to do is I like to take any clear liquid clay and I just put a little dab on there like so, and I find that this counteracts that cornstarch quite well. And you don't want much. You don't want it to be slick, you don't want it to be extremely sticky. You just want a little bit of liquid clay on there, just to get rid of that really non-stick effect. And you just rub that on. And now notice that I am rubbing it on while the clay is still sitting in the texture stamp. The reason for this is because it's not going to affect my design. If I was to press this liquid clay across the back when I had taken it out of the texture stamp, I would be flattening out my texture, which is not something that you want. So now I've got a nice sticky back that feels just slightly stickier than what it was before I put the cornstarch on. So now we should be able to lift this up really easily without any problems, because we have a beautiful texture, nice and crisp, and our back is ready to stick that onto whatever we want. So that is how I tend to deal with hard texture stamps. So hopefully that helped you in some way. Now I want to move on to tip 3 regarding texture rollers. So here are 2 examples. Some texture rollers are not too deep and also come with these little handbars at the end. Those are really good rollers, but sometimes really nice rollers with great patterns will come and they won't have these little bars on the end, and especially some of them, if they have nice deep textures, they can be a little painful to roll. So a tip for that when you are working with your clay is to just grab your clay, and now we don't want our roller to stick. Typically when you are using rollers you also need to dust a little bit of cornstarch on the front. I don't need to dust it on the back, because the back is just going to be sticking to my work surface. So don't worry about dusting on the back. Just going to get rid of that. And you can use water if you want. I find that it isn't really as effective as cornstarch, but it means that you can dry and it does not affect the stickiness of the clay. But do be careful with some brands like Pardo and Cernit react really badly to water and they actually become unworkable. So don't put any water with those brands. Okay, so normally with a roller you would just take this and you would just roll straight across and it would be just fine. With something like this, you might need to take a little bit of a different approach. So I'm going to approach it right at the end, and I'm going to take an acrylic burlap with a little one of these scrapbooking stamps so that it is nice and sticky. And I'm going to start on one end, and I'm going to stand up to do this. And I'm going to press down, and I'm going to start rolling. Okay. And you could continue rolling if you wanted to, but you can see that gives a pretty good impression. And this, if you're wondering, is a, sorry, the name escaped me for a second. They are core rollers, and they give really, really beautiful detailed textures. Much deeper than typical texture rollers, but they can be a little painful to roll, as I showed. So that is how you would get a really nice deep texture that is fairly even and without hurting your fingers. Then you could just lift this up, and you would typically use a blade to do that, like so. And the back is still nice and sticky, and the front is ready to use. So that is tip number 3. Now we're going to move on to the last tip. And this one depends really on what texture stamp you're using. I create silicone textures, and they're made out of pretty hard silicone, so something like this would press into the clay really well. But a lot of them have really fine detail, like this mushroom stamp that I have, and I find that the clay can sometimes be a little bit rebellious when it comes to pressing into this, because this is a really non-stick material, so you don't need to spray any water, any cornstarch on this to press the clay in. But oftentimes it can be a little bit of a disadvantage, so I want to show you how to counteract that. So typically you would just take this. If it was a not too detailed stamp, such as this one, you would just take your clay, lay it over the top, and then press from one end to the other, and you would get a really good impression. If it was lifting up a little bit, you would brush a little bit of cornstarch on the back, and you would continue pressing, and that would be typically how you would use these stamps. However, if some are giving you trouble, what I like to do is I like to take my clay, and on one side I like to take some clear liquid clay. Any clear liquid clay will work. I typically work with the Kato brand, but any will work. Now just brush some clay over the surface, and then I will rub. And you don't need a lot, you don't want it to be slick, you just want to add a little bit, and this is going to add to the stickiness of the clay, which will counteract that non-stick property that most silicone stamps have. And I have had this sort of trouble with some of the rubber stamp brands. Any rubber stamp can do this. Any non-stick stamp can do this. So if you're having trouble with it, just add a tiny layer of liquid clay. You can see it's made it quite glossy. Lay that liquid clay side down into your texture, and then I like to use a sponge for the next part. So any makeup sponge will work. You could dust cornstarch over the back and then press, but I find that this works really well as well. So here's a little makeup sponge that I have, and I'll take that and I'll press. And you could use this with the hard polymer clay stamps as well. If you didn't want to put cornstarch on the back, you could put no cornstarch on the back and just on the front, and you could press them in with a sponge. And so you can see that I am pressing this in. It's going to be sticking into the stamp nicely. And so I will just continue going over with my fingers, and then I might go over it with the roller. Like so. And this sponge is a little bit dirty, but that's okay. So I'll just continue pressing, and whenever you press into a stamp, you want to be going from one side to the other. You don't want to be going and pressing all over the place, because what happens then is you typically you trap air bubbles. Okay, so now we've got that pretty much pressed in, and there's going to be a few places that you missed, so just go back and press those. And for those of you that don't like using your fingers to press in stamps, I typically like doing that. What you would do is you would start off at the front over here, and you would just press in this first line, then pop this down and start rolling. And that will also work pretty well. But I typically like to press it in by hand. Okay, and so that's pretty good. You can lift this up, and I'm going to stick this down onto the other side. And this helps me lift it from the stamp. Then you want to lift it like so. And you can see we've got a really beautiful, detailed, deep texture. And that liquid clay is not going to cause any trouble at all. It's just created a little bit of a stickiness. All you have to do is just rub over the top consistently a few times, and it will generally leach in. And if it's giving you a lot of trouble, generally it's because you put a little bit too much liquid clay on. But that's a tip that I discovered fairly recently when one of my particular designs was giving me a bit of trouble because it was really detailed, and I just didn't want to give up on it, and this is the tip that saved the design. So hopefully that was helpful to you. Keep in mind that there are lots of stamps that are fairly non-stick. They can be rubber, silicone, even some photopolymer ones have given me a little bit of trouble with this. So if they're not sticking and you're not getting a nice clean texture, try this out. It works really well. The only stamp that you don't want to be trying this out on is if you're using a roller or a hard stamp that is made from polymer clay. These ones you don't want to do that because it's going to actually start to bond your clay to your polymer clay texture stamp, and it's just going to get all the clay up in the roller. So these ones you want to be using cornstarch to prevent sticking, and with rubber stamps or silicone ones, try them out beforehand without putting liquid clay on. If they're giving trouble, put a little layer of liquid clay on and they should work really well. So I do hope that that little tip video was helpful to you, and that you found a few tips on there that will help you in future. Please let me know what you thought, and if you would like more tip tutorials like this one in the future. I do have one on cutters, so I'll provide a link to that in the links below in the description below the video, and that will show you how to use 3D printed cutters without getting stuck in the cutter, because that seems to be a fairly common problem. So if you are having problems with certain tools such as stamps, silk screen stencil, something along those lines, let me know in the comments below and I'll work on some tips and tricks and I'll make a video as soon as I can. And as always, I'll see you in the next tutorial. Bye for now.